All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. It's a real pleasure to be here today and to be discussing Stuart Schrader's excellent book, Badges Without Borders, How Global Counterinsurgency Transformed American Policing. I'll be moderating the discussion between Stuart and Julian. I'll just give a brief introduction of both of them. And the way we'll proceed for today is that Julian and Stuart will have a conversation for about 45 minutes. Please feel free to use the Q&A option on your screen to submit your questions at any time. And then after that, we'll take some audience questions. So introductions now. Stuart Schrader is Associate Director of the Program in Racism, Immigration, and Citizenship at the Johns Hopkins University, where he is a lecturer in sociology, also teaching classes in Africana Studies and International Studies. Stuart earned a PhD in American Studies from NYU in 2015. His book, Badges Without Borders, How Global Counterinsurgency Transformed American Policing, came out last year from the University of California Press. He has published numerous articles on policing and US global power, with his newest article about to come out any day in the next issue of N+1 on the figure of the global policeman after the uprisings of 2020. In conversation with him today is Julian Go. Julian is professor of sociology at the University of Chicago, one of our newest colleagues here, so we also welcome him. His research and writing explores the social logics of imperial formations and modern colonialism, post-colonial and decolonial thought, and related questions of social theory, epistemology, and knowledge, as well as global historical sociology. His books include The American Colonial State in the Philippines, Global Perspectives, American Empire and the Politics of Meaning, and Patterns of Empire, the British and American Empires, 1688 to the present. His current projects include the history of imperialism's impact upon police militarization in the US, the UK, and France. I just want to say how timely and important this conversation is in the context, of course, of the uprisings over the summer, but also of the ways in which policing and police violence have shaped conversations on this campus since the summer with the actions of Care Not Cops and the More Than Diversity campaign. I think one of the things Stuart's work does so profoundly and powerfully is help us think about the intersections between the domestic and the foreign in ways that avoids a search for origins and thinks about their mutual constitution. So with that, I'll turn it over to Julian.
Thanks, thanks to the Center for organizing this and for having me. It's a great position to be in, to have this conversation with Stuart. It's a great honor. And Stuart, congrats on the book. As you know, I've been waiting for a long time for this book, and I'm so glad to see it out. And it's received an immense amount of well-deserved attention. So it's really great to see. I have some questions that vary from, just the basic story of the book to some more methodological and theoretical questions. And so I thought I'd start with the assumption that maybe a lot of the viewers might not have had a chance to go through the book quite carefully enough. So that maybe a couple questions just about some main themes of the book would help. Starting with, there's this guy, Byron Engel, in the book, and he seems to be an important actor. And there's this Office of Public Safety, which many people might not know about. So can you tell us a little bit about who was this guy, Byron Engel, and what's going on with the OPS?
Sure. Thanks so much, Julian and Adam. It's really great to be here. Thank you to the center. I'm so glad to have all of you here for this conversation. So Byron Engel is one of the main characters in the book. He was a police officer from Kansas City who started his police career in the late 1930s. And he went on to be, I would argue, one of the most important and yet least well-known figures of US global power during the Cold War. He was something of a phenom in the world of policing. He rose through the ranks quite quickly in Kansas City. And this was a moment of profound transformation in the police force in Kansas City because an extremely powerful municipal political machine was coming to an end. And when it came to an end, the real signal that it was over was when the police force kind of changed hands. And Engel was one of the officers hired at that moment. And he excelled. He had an expertise in training, and particularly training in training officers in crowd and riot control. And when World War II happened, he stayed behind. He stayed in Kansas City, whereas many police officers actually, although they could usually avoid the draft, not always, but they could usually avoid the draft, but many nevertheless enlisted and went overseas. He did not. But at war's end, because of his reputation for being this kind of expert in police training, he was invited to go to Japan during the occupation to work on retraining the Japanese police force. And so he left Kansas City and went to Japan in early 1946, and he basically never looked back and spent the rest of his career traveling the globe, and in fact became one of the most widely traveled individuals in the Foreign Service over the next few decades. In the 1950s, he started to work for the CIA, and in 1962, he became the director of the Office of Public Safety, as you mentioned. So the Office of Public Safety existed from 1962 to 1975, and it was the foreign police assistance arm of the US government. It was housed in the Agency for International Development. And Engel ran this body after having worked covertly for the CIA doing police training. Up until that point, when he went to work for AID, he became an overt figure. He kept secret ties to the CIA at this moment, but he was no longer kind of working behind the scenes. Now he was working publicly. Engel is an interesting figure. I found him quite interesting. He inspired both intense loyalty and intense hatred. He was a kind of polarizing figure. I think in part, some people thought he was a kind of bureaucratic genius. Some people thought he was really just kind of an imperious jerk. And I actually think that this kind of two-faced evaluation of him among various figures is consistent with a number of figures in that moment. A figure like William Colby, who went on to be the CIA director, who was working alongside Engel. If you read biographies of him, they similarly kind of illustrate him as being both intensely loved and intensely hated by different people. I think this was kind of par for the course for the national security state and this particular moment. And so, I focus on Engel's biography because I think he illustrates certain trends. I mean, he's a key figure, but he's a kind of bearer of a certain kind of structure. And I look at another two figures in the book who were close colleagues of his, who had slightly different roles, but also similarly, I think, were kind of bearers of certain types of structures that I think we could talk about. Ultimately, the Office of Public Safety, as I said, created in 1962, brought together disparate programs that were a little bit dispersed around the globe. They were all now put under one roof. They were now under the directorship of Engel, and most importantly, they had their own budget line that no cost-cutting bureaucrat could affect. And ultimately, then the Office of Public Safety sent police advisors and experts to 52 countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. They brought trainees, high-ranking police trainees, about 9,000 of them from 77 countries to the United States in this period. And so the book focuses on that overseas work of the Office of Public Safety, but then also examines its reverberations domestically and how it shaped the fortunes of policing domestically. And Engel, of course, is also quite important to this. He's a bridge figure between foreign and domestic spheres.
Great, thank you. I mean, those reverberations later, right? The importance of Engel and the OPS. I mean, one of the amazing things is how you show that this was not just a part of an American project overseas, that it had these fundamental implications for policing in the United States. And I want to get to that, but I also want to just dwell a little bit more about this sort of overseas project of the OPS. For scholars and historians of the post-World War II period, and for people such as myself interested in sort of America's informal empire, as I would think of it, that sat alongside its colonial empire, the story of policing these countries is sort of untold, and America's role in sort of in trying to reform and professionalize and advise these police forces. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about how you see that policing project as part of a larger story of American dominance in the post-World War II period, or how does it fit into larger projects of American imperial power in that period?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that the policing aspect of US power on a global scale is underappreciated. And yet when one looks at the foundational texts of the Cold War, written by people like George Kennan, so much of the way that they characterize the problem of the Soviet Union or the problem of totalitarianism is because of the secret police that holds immense power in other countries, and the fear really is that countries of what came to be called the Third World would similarly develop these highly authoritarian police forces. And it comes to be perhaps a great historical irony, if you like, that the United States then fights the Cold War by empowering and assisting the police of, like I said, 52 countries. The way that the United States wanted to, particularly national security experts, intelligence experts, the way that these experts wanted to assure US influence but not engender rebellion or revolution was to kind of walk a very fine line between violating the sovereignty of these, in many cases, newly independent nations, and giving them too much latitude so that they could either go socialist or communist, or simply just become too strongly nationalist in the eyes of the Americans. And so the police assistance project, was thought to be the way to avoid these poles, or to kind of go between these poles. On the one hand, it could suppress revolutionary movements. On the other hand, it wasn't as it wasn't as strong and open a display of kind of brutal American force as a military invasion, or even as simply empowering the militaries of all these other countries. Now, it's absolutely true that at the same time as police assistance is being offered to all of these countries, military assistance is being offered typically at the same time. But most of the military assistance was geared toward what they called external aggression, whereas police assistance was geared toward internal security or internal defense. And in some cases, of course, the military was enlisted in this program as well. And I think we're apt to adopt the phrase militarization of policing all the way up into 2020. And I think a trend that we might pay more attention to historically is the kind of politicization or policification of the military in this period. And the Office of Public Safety plays some roles in this, although they were often very insistent that they were a civilian body, not a military body. And part of that was simply because, of course, the Department of Defense had a huge budget and had huge power in Congress. And if OPS was seen to duplicate their efforts, well, then they might be eliminated. So they had to always try to distinguish themselves as strictly civilian. But I think that I have some trouble with that claim.
Yeah. It is interesting how, right, compared to the sort of colonial projects that the United States and other European powers were engaging in, where colonial state building was so much more forthright and the building up of these forces was a simple matter. There's a sense in which the story you tell is very much a story about a more subtle forms of power, more hidden forms of power that insinuate these important distinctions that we take for granted between civil and military and so on. And I really, really think that the story you tell in that book is really profound. One related issue there is, the discourse or the ideology behind what the OPS was doing, or the ideology of the OPS. You talk about it as the OPS thought that they were professionalizing police forces, right? Which brings up the image of a upstanding, professional, autonomous force. But there's also the story of client regimes of the U.S. in this period that are dictatorial regimes and brutal policing, and a lot of these police forces end up being corrupt tools of dictators. So how did the OPS? I mean, you could see that really cynically, right? You could read this as, the OPS is just being part of this sort of neo-imperial power that is cynically, mobilizing and training corrupt powers for America's ends. Or you could maybe think about it as a project that went awry, right? And that they did sort of sincerely hope to professionalize, but as any kind of state building projects go, they always get trapped in these complexities. And I don't know, how do you make sense of this? I mean, how cynical are you about this rhetoric of professionalization and improving police overseas? Because it's something that, it persists throughout, and often even in the United States, right? Professionalization is a cover or a ruse for other, more nefarious projects.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a really important question. And I would say that if you were to ask different public safety advisors, a couple of them are still alive. And I haven't spoken to them, but other colleagues of mine like Nicole Siegel have interviewed them. And some of them would say that they were absolutely trying to professionalize the police. They were not interested in repression. They were interested in teaching police how to be less repressive. And then others of them would say, of course, what else could we possibly have been trying to do except, teach repression? So I think there was a little bit of confusion among them about the mission. And part of this has to do simply with policing itself, which is to say that the idea of a non-repressive police apparatus is a little bit of an oxymoron. Byron Engel was insistent that the tools of, fighting communism, fighting subversion, were the tools of good everyday policing. He gets brought before Congress, and they ask him, a kind of conservative congressman, I think from Iowa, is a little skeptical of the whole thing, and says, well, this is just a law and order thing. This is not about subversion. And Engel basically says there's no difference between, fighting crime and fighting subversion. The exact quote he uses: the principles of good police management and good investigative techniques, these are the same, whether fighting crime or subversion. I think it's worth taking that seriously, because I think, to the extent that the Office of Public Safety has been discussed previously in the historical literature, the readings of it are either the kind of New Left critique, which is just that it's a vehicle of U.S. neo-imperialism. It's simply repressive, and I'm deeply sympathetic to that critique, and I've learned quite a lot from it. But then there's another critique that comes a little bit more out of the criminology or policing literature, which basically says, look, the Office of Public Safety had limited resources. They were going into these countries for a relatively short period of time. They would send a couple advisors, to man a program in a country that had thousands of police officers. So really, how much impact could they possibly have had? And I think there's something to that as well. But ultimately, I think I try to synthesize these two positions to show that, on the one hand, I think Engel was right in his description of what he was trying to achieve, that controlling subversion was done through everyday policing techniques. And I also think that the ability to equip and upgrade police at the kind of regular patrol level didn't take a huge amount of resources from the United States. It was possible to do on a shoestring budget. That was part of what made OPS interesting to a lot of people in the National Security Council, was how cheap it was. They were quite happy about that. but then also that there were competing ideas of how to achieve order or how to defeat communism, where both liberals and conservatives in the foreign policy apparatus saw the Office of Public Safety as the vehicle to do that. Liberals thought, oh well, this is just like we're going to have police the same way we have police in the United States, and of course they were a bit blind and ignorant about how policing in the United States actually operated, how racist it was. But then you had conservatives who kind of knew what was going to happen when you empowered police in other countries, knew how repressive they would be, and they always kind of almost blackmailed the liberals, which was to say, look, if you want your liberal developmentalism to succeed, if you want to achieve better outcomes in terms of economic and educational and various other indicators, well, you have to assure the security, the basic ground of security first, right? And so liberals always went along with that. And then, after they put all this, put their resources, put the resources of the Office of Public Safety into effect, then they would, suddenly find that death squads had emerged, or people were getting disappeared, or their massacres or whatever committed by police or sometimes off-duty police. And then they would write these memos back to Washington saying, like, what is going on? I can't believe this. But Washington would respond and say, like, well, yeah, like these things are necessarily going to go hand in hand, and that kind of naivete, you encounter it all over the archive. It's a little bit hard to believe that people could have been so naive, but I actually think that there is something about taking it seriously that is instructive, because it helps us to like disaggregate the kind of monolith of the national security state. That if anything, I would just say that, like, I think the New Left critique is like 97% correct, but treating the national security state as monolithic and not as kind of cross-cut by different interests and different intentions and certainly by just like a lot of bureaucratic infighting. I think that's really important, and I try to show some of that bureaucratic infighting in the book. And it turns out that Engel succeeded. He won a lot of bureaucratic infighting, and that's part of why it's, I think, valuable to pay attention to him.
Yeah, and it's the way I read it, of course, coming from my interests. It's not only that the story sort of complexifies America's national security state. It really complexifies for me like our understanding of empire, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of the complexities to empire, which can never be reduced down to single interests or single actors. And so I would actually enlist the story you tell for maybe theorizing the imperial state in a more Polancian way of different segments of the American state being involved in different aspects of imperialism overseas and in dealing with these different problems. I really think your book's just amazing for thinking about that. But the other thing is that once you start thinking about this as empire, once I start thinking about it as empire, then you naturally are led to the recognition that like empires everywhere, this project would not go without reverberations at home, as you mentioned. And so this is where I think your story becomes really all the more fascinating, that this project of professionalization and sort of seeing anti-crime efforts as anti-insurgency efforts or counterinsurgency efforts, required all these tools and ideologies and strategies that also sort of impacted policing at home. And you tell a great story about how we can't really think about this as a kind of boomerang effect, like it starts here and goes there, or starts on, but it's really actors operating and strategizing and devising power relations in a singular field. Yeah. that kind of goes beyond here and there. And so I don't know, could you give us, for those people who haven't read the book, maybe a couple of examples of sort of some of the tools or the ideologies or the counterinsurgency forms that you think it's better to think of them as sort of a part of a singular field?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's funny. I found this photograph after the book was done, and I wish I had seen it before so I could have put it in the book. But it's a photograph of a car pulled off on the side of the road in South Vietnam. I think it's from 1959 or so. And there's a couple of Vietnamese police officers who have the trunk open, they have a door open, and they're clearly searching the car the same way, if you drive on the highway any day, you will see police, searching a car. And there's a US advisor, who's not wearing a uniform. The cops are wearing uniforms. He's just wearing like a jacket and button-down shirt. And he's just kind of watching over and clearly instructing them in how to, accurately and effectively execute a search of a car. The same way that he would be advising, his junior, trainees if he were back in Michigan or wherever, right? They tried really hard. The public safety advisors tried really hard to make it so that this single field of policing existed, right? It's like it doesn't exist naturally, but they produce it. They create it by going to other countries and saying, okay, like this is how we do a search of a car. This is how we do a stop and frisk, So those repertoires of policing are, in their minds, highly modular and transferable. They will work anywhere. And in fact, of course, we know that stop and frisk ultimately gets codified through a really fascinating set of Supreme Court decisions, Terry versus Ohio and so forth, which I teach my students about how this all works. But for the public safety advisors, like the way that the Supreme Court made stop and frisk legal is not what's important. What's important is the very tangible and granular aspects of the repertoire, and that's what can be transferred. The legal framework and legal infrastructure, they just kind of bracket. It's not their concern, and of course that it's absolutely the case that they would have been constrained by legal infrastructures in other countries, but they just said that's not what we're concerned about. We're concerned with reducing police to its kind of practical elements. They also, of course, technology is the most obvious way that there are easy transfers across borders. So I talk about a couple that have to do with telecommunications. I mean, the Office of Public Safety was really interested in bringing new telecommunications technologies around the globe, and also what that would do would integrate like, headquarters and precinct houses in cities, headquarters and regional police operations across the countryside, and then even across different countries. So they set up a regional telecommunications network in Central America, across all the countries in Central America. So those types of radio and telecommunications technologies were easily exported and then imported back home. And one of the things that, again, made it easy to adopt some of the stuff back home is that OPS figured out how to devise really cheap technologies, because of course the idea was the Foreign Assistance Program doesn't have a huge budget, so it needs cheap radios. Well, so develop a walkie-talkie that doesn't have all the bells and whistles that they might try to sell to a city in the United States, develop a cheaper one, sell it to a country overseas. But then lo and behold, guess what? The budgets in cities in the United States are really limited. So they want the cheap model without the bells and whistles as well, which happened to be developed by public safety advisors. And then, the main one that I focus on, the main technology is CS, which is, we call tear gas today. And I have a whole chapter about CS and kind of, it's a technology that has been on a lot of people's minds over the past few months because police have been using it so gratuitously in the United States. And I would just say that one thing is that the Office of Public Safety, specifically Byron Engel, recommends using tear gas for crowd control because of the idea that it is less likely to engender more revolt, make the crowds more angry, make the rebellion more intense, as compared to, say, using bayonets or literally, firing live rounds into crowds. for all of the brutality and excessiveness of the police over the summer of 2020 in the United States, it is the case that in large part they haven't used bayonets or fired live rounds into crowds. They have used tear gas to hurt people. There's no question about that. But the usage of this weapon is basically consistent with what came into being in the 1960s based on the experience I explore in the book.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that story is really fascinating because, well, if you think about not only, tear gas, but how it's articulated with these sort of larger ideologies of counterinsurgency, which are circulating not only within the United States and to the countries the OPS were operating, but also circulating in the British Empire, for example, right? And there's, CS gas, forms of tear gas, of course, emerge partly within the British Empire. And what's interesting is, when you think about these other cases, like the British and the development of the British police, there's also a similar sort of field of vision, right? And even the founding of the London police was, forged by Peel, thinking about London and Ireland in the same field. But what's also interesting is, right, it was the same field, but, Peel and other people did a lot of differentiation, right? And even when the British police started debating whether or not they should use CS gas at home, so to speak, there was a lot of sort of differentiation about what not only what they can get away with here, but they might not get, or what they can get away with overseas, but maybe not here. But there's some sense of sort of comparison and attempts to think about, yes, it's a singular field of vision, but we have to modulate a little bit some of these tools or technologies. Is there a place for that kind of modulation in your story, or is it really just, just a single field and it's all the same thing?
Well, I think they absolutely recognize that it's an uneven terrain, but I think that the more that the Office of Public Safety ran into challenges presented by how uneven this terrain was and how different the places where they were deployed around the country, the more they kind of doubled down on their insistence that actually everything is modular and interchangeable. A cop is a cop no matter where they are, no matter, and they literally will say, no matter their skin color, they're all brothers, et cetera. And that just kind of raises the question of racialization. And I really think that, of course, I spent a lot of time on this question in the book. And I think, at least as it pertains to this line of inquiry, I do think that the fact of US policing historically having been so deeply tied up in and formed through the control of African-American social life and the maintenance of the color line and the prevention of Black political organization, I think that really becomes the key organizing principle for the Office of Public Safety. I mean, it's disavowed. It'll like bubble up to the surface. They can't kind of help it from always creeping into their discourse, but they're quite intentional about trying not to seem like they're racist, even as what makes them sure that the United States is a kind of testing ground for practices that can be exported is because in the United States, there's one quote I have in the book, where it's like, which actually comes from a Southern segregationist congressman, but he says something like the police and the police in the United States and the soldiers in Vietnam, have a lot in common. He says the police know guerrilla warfare because they deal with it on a day-to-day basis. And what he means is what police are dealing with is not just Black political activity in American cities, but just Black social life, right? That's what he's thinking about. And so I think that there's an interesting way that they try to read and place upon other countries a kind of US racial script that of course doesn't always work. But what's even more interesting in some ways, I think that's like a little bit predictable, but what's even more interesting is that some of the police trainees, the ones who are receiving the training, are like a little worried that they're going to be treated as if, there's literally a quote from this one South Vietnamese cop who says, basically like, I know how police in the United States, he's saying this to a public safety advisor, I know how you police in the United States treat Negroes. Are you going to treat us that way? Yeah. And the thing I argue is like, well, they're not necessarily going to treat the South Vietnamese police that way. They're going to teach the South Vietnamese police how to treat, the VC that way, right? Yeah. So it's unavoidable. It's just that kind of the ground of racialization is unavoidable, even as the project of racial liberalism is kind of organizing this whole project of U.S. power in this period.
Yeah, and there's so many questions come up about race and also tons more questions about police tactics and so on being developed in this singular field. And for people who haven't yet read the book, there's this fantastic story you tell about the rise of broken windows policing in the United States. And most in my field of sociology and most criminologists tell this standard story of the rise of broken windows policing and its implications for the carceral state and so on, but no one really has thought about it in this more global way. I think your story has so much to tell us about these traditional narratives that we have about the rise of maintenance order policing and broken windows policing in just really profound way. And I think we can talk about that, but I also want to think about the broader methodological move you make here. And here I want to get to some more theoretical and methodological questions. This move of being able to see policing in a singular vision, right? It's so, for scholars, it's a really profound, I think, insight given the state of the literature. Of course, as you point out, thinking in the singular field of vision is something that the Black Panthers already did and social movements have already thought about, but scholars, it's taking us so long, and you're one of the only books that have really enabled us to think about policing in this more transnational or global way. Can you tell me why has it taken so long, or what is it about, or why were you able to see this and others haven't? I think this is also a lesson for students. I mean, there might be something about disciplinary boundaries. I know that you were trained in sort of American studies, maybe.
Yeah.
I'm trained in sociology, and so when I did my earlier work on U.S. colonialism in Puerto Rico and the Philippines and Guam and Samoa, that really work hadn't been done, and I was astounded. But then it made sense to me because the way historians do things is, you're Americanist or you're studying the Philippines, you're South, there are all these sort of disciplinary boundaries that prevent us from seeing things in certain ways. As a sociologist, I was an outsider to history. So I could think about it differently. And so much of my early work was really aimed at that. And I think maybe, I don't know, does the disciplinary situation of the scholarship actually prevent us from seeing these profound connections, and is that something that you would attribute to, or is it's not just a matter of archive, right? It's not like you just found an archive. It's you really
no,
yeah. So can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I do think that there is a disciplinary factor. It's not to say that a U.S. a strictly trained U.S. historian couldn't have written this book, but it certainly helped that I was in American Studies. I had nobody ever said no to me, basically, for better or worse. And that meant that I could just experiment and try different things. I was also influenced. I was really interdisciplinary. I was influenced by historical sociology, and various approaches, whether world systems or some of the work that you've been doing, Julian, or folks like George Steinmetz, people who are doing work that's trying to think of social fields outside of methodological nationalism. Yeah. I think that the real challenge for me was a very practical one, and you mentioned the archives, and it was just simply that. And when you go to the archives, when you go to the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, and you are interested in a project that is kind of, for me, it was originally really about police militarization. So police is a civilian thing, the military is a military thing. When you walk into that room, you have to choose which side of the room do you go to, which archivists do you talk to? Do you talk to the ones who do the Department of Defense records? Do you talk to the ones who do the, AID records, right? And I was like, well, what if I'm interested in something that's kind of in between or a little bit of both? And they're basically like, well, look, you got to choose, right? So that is just a practical challenge. And I guess I would just say for graduate students, for people who are starting out trying to do this work, I would basically say, like, yes, you do have to choose, obviously, for practical reasons, but you don't have to let yourself be, disciplined by the archive. There's a way to read outside the archive and, kind of against the grain. I mean, I was very influenced by Ann Stoler, even though I do, quite different work from her, but, she thinks so carefully about, what she calls the archival grain, right? So it was helpful to know that people had done it in different fields in different ways. But it was actually a difficult practical challenge, and I ultimately, in my research, I use the records of USAID, I use the records of the National Security Council, which are foreign relations oriented, obviously. But when I found references to, if I found a reference to Newark in the AID records, I would, like, a light bulb would go off and I would say, okay, like, I need to pay attention to why is this here? And I need to try to, like, think really deeply and theorize why this is here. And then you let it lead me to another place. And what I might find when I go to the kind of domestic archives, I might find that in, papers that purport to be about Newark, well, all of a sudden there's a mention of, Hong Kong or Saigon or whatever. And so I really tried to sit with those out of place references. And I just, I definitely don't want to sound like I'm being critical of my US history colleagues, but it's absolutely the case that I've looked at some of the same records as other, scholars of the carceral state, and literally the same folders, we cite the same folders. And I just assume that when they see this reference to Saigon, they just flip right past it. Whereas I was like, okay, I'm stopping on this page and I'm going to figure out why the hell is this word here? And, it, of course, where it led me was to say, well, yeah, the Black Panther Party would not be at all surprised that this word is here, right? They were saying at the very, in 1967, 1968, they were saying, if you look at the records of the national security state and the war in Vietnam, you'll find references to US cities and vice versa, right? They were saying that. Of course, they didn't have access to those records. I did. They had now been declassified, and so in some ways, it helped that I had been a reader of the Panthers. My advisor had written about the Panthers, so I was primed to take that stuff seriously in a way where, rather than to just kind of think to myself, okay, I'm seeing this reference in the archive, I don't know what to make of it, I'm just going to flip past it and assume it's unimportant. And that's just kind of what I hope scholars can do with my work, is to say, like, not just dismiss the urge to avoid methodological nationalism out of hand and just say, okay, I'm going to be comfortable with methodological nationalism, but actually say, like, why should I choose this approach? Like, of course, there's many disciplinary and various other pressures, archival pressures. There's all kinds of reasons to, make a methodologically nationalist approach, but that doesn't mean it's right. That doesn't mean it's adequate to the object. And I was really trying to figure out, what is the approach that's adequate to the object I'm trying to understand. I didn't necessarily even know what the object was from the outset, but I was inclined to think that I couldn't just figure it out using a very traditional US history approach.
Yeah, and that's fascinating. I mean, there's, I think, deep methodological lessons here for thinking about how to do transnational work, how to do sort of work that is attentive to, going beyond these boundaries. We could talk more about those. I think maybe there are some questions coming in, so I think maybe we can open it up and get some other questions in here.
Sure. And if folks want, they can use the Q&A button to add more questions, but we do have a couple. So First, Maya asks, how do the conclusions of your book help us to understand post-conflict international policing by the United Nations or other international institutions today?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I would have to say that I don't know a huge amount about it, but I would say that the Office of Public Safety is shut down by Congress at the urging of left-wing activists, anti-imperialist activists. It's shut down in 1974. It's overseas operations in 74, and then July 1st, 1975, it ceases all operations entirely. Basically, there were still some people who were being trained in the United States, and they sent them packing. Right. So then it's done. One way to read this would be to say, well, Congress outlawed overseas police assistance, and it came to an end. And yet, it turns out that what actually happened was this just actually opened the door to a massive explosion in new forms of transnational circulations of policing expertise. The United States is still at the center of this, but it's not the only player. During the Cold War period, there were other players, but the United States was dominant, and the United States was the Office of Public Safety, Byron Engel himself was very wary of other players getting involved. And this the question of like the comparison with the British is kind of important here, because on the one hand, he's interested in learning from the British and paying attention to them, but if they start getting too much attention, he starts getting nervous. And so, there's a guy called Robert Thompson, who is a kind of one of the foremost British counterinsurgency experts. And at first, Engel is willing to kind of have a sit-down conversation with him and learn from the British, but then he starts seeing Thompson getting meetings in the Oval Office, and he's like, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. He sends this like angry memo where he reviews Thompson's CV and says, like, look at his CV. He doesn't have nearly the policing experience that I have or that my colleagues have, right? So they're very protective of their turf. After 1975, there is no single agency in the United States to be protective of turf. So there's just an efflorescence. And it's happening also now in private sector domains. The private security contracting and consulting field grows immensely. Some of the public safety advisors themselves are involved in that. They're forming companies that are now offering police training for hire. And then, these other international bodies get involved. So today, NATO is involved, the EU is involved, and of course, the UN has its own operations. I think that the interesting thing for me, again, I'm not a huge expert on UN post-conflict policing, but the interesting thing for me is that policing ends up being what makes the kind of the conflict post-conflict divide a little bit blurry, because policing is operating on both sides of it. During wars, policing actually plays a really important role, and police often get empowered during wartime. And then in many cases, the police, after wars end, there will be a reorganization of the force and so on. But there's a certain level of consistency. And I think that's kind of one of the really interesting and fruitful aspects to think about with policing, is just how it has this kind of protean quality and is able to operate across some divides of periodization and so forth that we would otherwise be using for our analyses.
There's a small question here just about whether USAID was under the State Department at this time, and maybe this is just an opportunity for you to say something about the ways police assistance was connected to US development and modernization ideologies, techniques, and practices as the kind of global counterpoint to racial liberalism in the US.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I would say about the kind of question of racial liberalism, if we think of, if Myrdal's American Dilemma is the kind of text of post 1945 U.S. racial liberalism. And the argument is that the United States will become it will rise to the role of the leader of the globe through overcoming the progressive overcoming of its own kind of racial fractures. The police experts that I look at are totally on board with this notion, and in fact, some of the ideas that we see in that text are prefigured in another text that I write about, that's written by a policing expert who goes on to work with the Office of Public Safety. He basically says, like, look, police in the United States need to become better at controlling political unrest. They need to be less racist and bigoted, because if they're not careful, they're going to kind of fan the flames of the global communist movement. And this is kind of the argument that Myrdal is making as well. So the State Department diplomats, the elites of the U.S. foreign policy establishment, actually, even though they come from very different, sort of pedigrees and pasts from these policing experts, they really see eye to eye on this issue. I think they're all informed, of course, by modernization theory. In some cases, modernization is very explicitly taught, but in some ways, it's just kind of the water that everybody is swimming in as the kind of predominant ideology of this moment. But how does it get translated into developmental programs? Well, I would say that counterinsurgency, and maybe I should just add a little footnote here, which is to say that counterinsurgency as a term is invented in the late 1950s. The Kennedy administration really adopts it and runs with it. And when they create the Office of Public Safety, the reason that they are trying to put so much emphasis on police assistance is because they think that it will be the key to counterinsurgency being successful. They make counterinsurgency the kind of watchword of US foreign policy in this period, because they're worried about again, like third world countries going communist. So countering insurgency means preventing insurgency. They're not thinking about rollback as much as containment in some ways, because they know that rollback is really hard. And this is one of these places where Engel and some of his people win a debate with some other people in the foreign policy establishment. So then what does counterinsurgency as a police project look like? I think you can basically break it apart into two halves. One half is counter-subversion, which is basically a population-oriented program that's meant to inoculate the population against the appeals of subversives, against the appeals of communists. This is about developmental uplift. It's about health campaigns, literacy campaigns, et cetera, et cetera. But in order for the population to be amenable to these development programs, they have to be kept separate from the active, subversive threat from the guerrillas. And this is the other piece, the counter-guerrilla piece. And so that meant actively targeting the guerrillas or the subversives. And police are thought to be the best tool to do this. They're either going to be arrested or imprisoned, or just killed outright. Or the best case scenario, they're going to be stopped at the border by new border police that the United States is going to put into place. Now, of course, the great challenge that counterinsurgency ran into is that it was very hard to figure out, okay, who's just the regular old population whose loyalties are kind of up for grabs and who can be convinced by developmental aid to be loyal, politically loyal, and who are the people who are, the actual subversives, the insurgents and so forth. They blur together. And so that, of course, is what leads to the targeting of, civilians and non-combatants and so forth in counterinsurgency. And it has this kind of inherently escalatory logic where the population ends up, the kind of, innocents get targeted and arrested or killed. It makes people really mad, and then they're liable to agree with the subversive propaganda or whatever, and it just kind of spirals, right? So, but police not only are tasked with doing the work of countering the guerrillas, they're also integrated into the developmental apparatus. So what OPS ends up doing in a lot of countries is not only operating alongside other technical assistance experts, working for AID. There's going to be like an irrigation or agricultural advisor and the police advisor. They're going to ride in the same Jeep to whatever town, but also that the people from the locals, the native population, who they're going to be training. In some cases, they're going to train the same person to be both a cop and a teacher or a health worker or whatever, because there's limited kind of manpower resources. So you end up having, it's like in the United States today, we have cops in schools. Like under OPS programming in places like Thailand, they had teachers who were cops. They're the same person, right? So that's how the kind of the developmental aspects and the counterinsurgency or counter-guerrilla aspects are just so deeply woven together.
Okay, next is a question from Emmer, who asks, the act of imperial policing was racialized in the British Empire. The theory of martial races, including Sikhs, the Irish, and the Scots, among others. Is there a parallel racialization of officers themselves in American imperial recruitment? Maybe this is an occasion for both you and Julian to reflect on what you think are the kind of similarities and differences between the story of empire and policing pre and post World War II.
Yeah. I mean, I'd love to hear Julian's thoughts about this, because I've learned so much from his research. But I guess I would say that I think that the early era of U.S. police training in U.S. empire in places like the Philippines does hold on to the idea of the kind of native informant who is going to be necessarily different from the U.S. Official, right? I think that also describes policing within the United States in the early part of the 20th century, where police, in New York City would hire Irish cops to police Irish neighborhoods, right? And then, interestingly, August Vollmer, who is the kind of grandfather of modern American policing, who comes out of the experience of counter-guerrilla warfare in the Philippines, I think he introduces the idea of more universal modes of police tactics. He's not the only one, but the real innovation, I think, that that gets taken up from him by figures like Engel is like, okay, we're going to teach these universal repertoires to the natives, right? So it's not that we need the natives because only the natives can make the population legible to us. It's that we need the natives to do the work of policing because the United States can't do it itself, but we're going to make them use our techniques, which we think are, basically can be, like I was saying, that they're modular and they're kind of homogenized. I don't know, Julian, would you agree with that account?
Yeah, no, completely. And I think that we can even go further back. I mean, this issue of relying upon so-called natives, it's embedded in the whole tradition of the invention of modern policing, right? I mean, you go back to the London Metropolitan Police, which was modeled after the Irish Constabulary and the Dublin Police. Those colonial counterinsurgency forces were themselves, right? You brought in the native, the British brought in the native, and that was always part of the strategy. It's partly, I don't know. I think you're totally right. So it's not just because they offer information, they need the labor. And when the Manchester Police is started, for example, and it's modeled after the Irish Constabulary to deal with the Irish in Manchester, there is an attempt to also bring in Irish into the police. It's partly, they need the manpower, and the Irish were, of course, treated poorly, and they had low wages. But it's partly legitimacy, and you see this up to the present. And this is this goes back all the way to colonial regimes of power, where you get labor and legitimacy. I think both by sort of incorporating the actual targets of police into the policing apparatus. So I don't know. I think that when you think about it in the big picture and historically, it's a deep-rooted colonial project.
Yeah. And if anything, I'm happy to agree to the accusation that I might say that it's like, too much a US practice, but I think actually, yeah, you're right that other empires are doing the same thing. And I think, just looking toward the present, as you mentioned, I mean, I think maybe a little bit less so in 2020, but certainly in 2015, we were hearing arguments from people who were trying to kind of solve the policing problem of the United States, saying like, well, hire more Black officers or hire more officers from a given city, like Baltimore. Like so many of the police in Baltimore are not actually from the city. So if only the police actually came from the city, that would fix some of these frictions with the community. Well, I think that, as Julian suggests, it may create somewhat greater legitimacy for the force, but this is not a solution. Like, this is the model of colonial policing from day one, and if anything, it's just doubling down again on the model rather than actually thinking through the fundamental problems of the model.
Yeah, completely.
Here's a question that sort of asks a more in a longue durée kind of way, the connection between empire and policing. So Gabrielle asks, how are the 1960s US counterinsurgency tactics shaped by police officers' understandings of themselves as settlers fighting indigenous people worldwide? What do you see as the relationship of anti-communist counter-revolution and settler colonialism?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and it's something that I was only able to go into a little bit in the book, but I go into a little bit more depth in a conversation I had with Tariq Barkawi that was published in International Politics Reviews, where I delve a little bit more deeply into this. I mean, it's, as many people will know, it's when you start looking into the U.S. military operations in Vietnam, the references to Native Americans are just all over the place, and so to the point that you have some figures basically writing letters back to Washington, to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, saying like, what should we do? I mean, it's really deep and profound. I think that fundamentally, Julian kind of already, raised this in some ways, but the problem of the challenge of understanding who in the population is the problem is a fundamental, it's the fundamental challenge of counterinsurgency, but it's the fundamental problem of empire. And the U.S. settler expansion in the 19th century relied heavily on native scouts, again with the idea that the natives would be the ones who would be able to kind of interpret the land, interpret the terrain, interpret the peoples, but also because there was a fundamental challenge of not enough manpower, not enough people to do this work, and oftentimes I think that massacres, literally, of communities, massacres were meant to produce new laborers, right? I mean, it was just like a violent dispossession where some of the survivors end up becoming imprisoned, taken captive or whatever. But ultimately, the way that they can gain some slight measure of their freedom back or their humanity back was to go in become employees of the U.S. military. So this logic of manpower deficits, legitimacy deficits, knowledge deficits, hampers the U.S. empire all the way up to the present. And it's the U.S. continually creates these situations for itself where it has to rely on these types of these forms of assistance. And that to me is one of the ways, of course, like that settler colonialism becomes a structure, right? That this repeated return to this pattern. So it's not just in the references to the to Native Americans and the names of the helicopters or whatever, or even in the sending the memo to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It's in the recognition that the Bureau of Indian Affairs might have an answer to the so-called problem, which is the same problem that the United States has been encountering for decades or centuries.
Okay, we have about 3 questions that are all about potential future areas of research. So Annabelle asks, do you see any potential for ethnographic work done on any of the subjects considered in your book? Anything or anywhere specifically? So
That's interesting. I myself am not interested in, say, like doing a ride along with a police officer. But I would say that I have a student who did one, an undergrad who did one in Baltimore, and like his one, 4-hour ride along, he came back and, shared his notes with me and told me about his experiences. And I feel like I learned more from my undergrad who did this ride along than I've learned from like, numerous monographs. So I do think it could be really fruitful. I just am not necessarily interested in doing it myself. I do think that the primary challenge right now, and I think it will certainly be increasing over the coming years, is just a question of access. I think that on the one hand, people on the left might, like myself, who are a little resistant to talk to cops, might, think that like, oh, if we call up the police and say we want to do research, they are not going to want to talk to us. Well, that might be true, but actually, I think they're not nearly as afraid of us as we are afraid of them. They know who has the power. So I do think it's possible, but I also think that with political polarization, with police, the way that police have fully I was going to say logged on, but that's not the right word. Logged on to Trumpism. I think that some problems of access are going to continue to present themselves, and it becomes even harder when we start thinking about the global picture, because then the kind of curtain of national security secrecy gets introduced, and that also creates a lot of challenges. Another factor that creates challenges for research is the privatization of so much of this stuff. The Office of Public Safety, not a huge amount of people knew that it was operating a police academy in the Georgetown neighborhood of Washington, D.C. until activists kind of called attention to it. But, it was right there operating in the middle of D.C. and one could have toured the facility if one asked, especially if you were a member of Congress. Compare that to the present where, say like ICE has these contracted private facilities where, because they're private facilities, they can refuse Congress people from even going inside them. So the privatization aspect really creates, I think, major research challenges, as does just the challenge of doing national security oriented research in the present rather than, post declassification.
Okay, Adam asks, what do you see as the most promising directions in the fast moving field of the carceral state, and what's next for you?
Yeah. So carceral state, history is of course has grown kind of explosively in size and interest over the past decade or so. I still think there's a lot that we just don't know. When it comes to the transnational dimensions, I think there's, so there's a lot we don't know about, say, like the carceral state in rural areas, jails. We tend to know more about what's happening in Washington. We tend to know more about what's happening in prisons as opposed to jails. We tend to know more about policing in cities than rural areas. So there's a lot that we can open open new lines of inquiry into. But when it comes to the transnational dimensions, it remains hard, as I said. I think historically, there's a few places that I think could be quite fruitful to look at. One is like the military police. We just don't really know that much about the military police. The works that have been written about them are relatively limited and kind of technical. The National Guard, there's a little bit more written about the National Guard in earlier moments rather than in later moments. So I think that could be another fruitful area. I think the U.S. Bureau of Prisons advisement overseas is something that people could look into. They worked hand in hand with the Office of Public Safety, and there's some really interesting stuff that I saw in the archives, but I still think there's more to be done. The book that I would really love to see is a book that actually looks at U.S. police assistance in South Vietnam from 1954 to 1975. There is no book that covers that whole period. There's kind of episodic accounts and not very much on the later part of the Second Republic. So there's plenty of work to be done out there. It's challenging because I think that people like me who do this type of work were a little bit hard to identify, in fields, and of course interdisciplinary spaces in general are just in crisis. So the incentives to do this type of work, I think, are limited. Even as the kind of I think the analytical and political payoff is quite strong. So yeah, and my own work. Well, maybe that's the last thing I'll talk about is what I'm doing next. Maybe we could take some more questions.
Okay. So Caleb asks, how do you think the summer of 2020 might influence the process of doing research on police in the US? More or less access for researchers, more attention and funding from universities, etc.?
Yeah, I think both of those is exactly right. There's probably going to be more attention and funding for research into policing in the carceral state more broadly, but at the same time, I also think that access is likely to become limited. I mean, I think that like in 2015, there was, police felt like they had a legitimacy problem that needed to be solved. The Obama administration really wanted to help police solve their legitimacy problem, and allowing researchers greater access was one way to solve that legitimacy problem. I do not think that 2020 is perceived within police departments as a legitimacy problem. I think it's perceived as a fundamentally political problem, and it's basically just a war. And they're not interested in regaining legitimacy. They're in the way that they were in the past. I think that the kind of liberal, progressive, professionalizer, reformer types who dominated in 2015 in the Obama era response, they've been sidelined. Those are the guys who are worried about legitimacy. They just are not the powerful voices right now, and they're being pushed from below by rank and file and extremist elements within police to reject the claims that legitimacy is the problem. In a weird way, I agree with them. Legitimacy, or lack of legitimacy, is not the problem. The problem is policing. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to abolish themselves.
Okay, Martha asks, there's a well-documented history of anthropology and other behavioral sciences being drawn into the project of counterinsurgency efforts overseas. And I think one of the things I found super interesting in the book was also the place of universities like MSU. There's a few others. I think Berkeley also comes up early. I wonder if you're aware of anthropologists giving support to domestic policing programs in similar ways.
Yeah, absolutely. So I had a chapter in my dissertation that was like a little bit more closely focused on this question and part of it was because in the, maybe first decade of the 2000s, so many people were writing about modernization theory. And, that became like kind of where so much new, interesting work in U.S. foreign relations history was happening. So I was really influenced by it in writing the dissertation. And so I think much more so than the book, I was trying to be in conversation with that literature. And what that meant was that I did a fair amount of research to try to figure out how social scientists were working kind of hand in hand with the public safety advisors. And I found some interesting things, one of which was simply that social scientists were coming to the Office of Public Safety with these kind of proposals to do research on behalf of OPS. And OPS was like, on the one hand, they were like, we're too busy. We don't have the kind of space and time to devote to lengthy research programs. But on the other hand, they were kind of like, we already know everything there is to know about how to use cops to control communism, right? We don't need some, egghead from MIT to tell us how to do that. So I think that what was interesting was that, and I think I would differ a little bit from the modernization literature, which sometimes, well, I don't know if this is exactly true, but I think sometimes it kind of makes it seem like it's demand driven, but I think that it was actually supply driven, and meaning that the intellectuals were seeking new fields to expand into, rather than that the kind of like on the ground counterinsurgency operators were like desperate for the wisdom of the professors or whatever. But I think, yeah, there's more to be said there. I have a couple pieces on the back burner, like maybe I'll move on with my life and they'll, only be in my papers that somebody will read in 100 years as unpublished. But maybe I'll actually finish an article or two where I write some of this stuff up in a different way. But it's super interesting, the relationship between, social scientists and counterinsurgency. I still think there's more to be said, even though this has been covered to some degree. And I would also just mention that this is a recurring problem. It's like, obviously, I think a lot of people know that it came about during the Iraq War, that social scientists and in Afghanistan, that social scientists were enlisted to help the war effort. But they themselves, I think, even recognized that they were just replicating an older script.
Yeah, I mean, we have our own version of that here at the University of Chicago with.
Yeah, and it actually goes back deep, right? I mean, the relationship between policing, counterinsurgency, and universities goes back to Vollmer, right? Vollmer starts the first criminology program at Berkeley, and Vollmer, thought of policing as counterinsurgency in many ways, and was bringing back his lessons from the Philippines. So it's a really long-standing relationship, and we don't know a whole lot about it, right? And there's so much more to be done historically on those relationships.
Absolutely, and in many ways, like it kind of occurred to me at some point, so much of social science, the history of social science, it has this looming specter of the crowd as like the object that if only social science can like figure out the crowd and how to manage it, what it's going to do, whatever. Policing is the same way. Like the greatest object of anxiety for police in 2020, in 1962 for the Office of Public Safety, or in Vollmer's heyday in the 1930s was the crowd. So there's it's probably even more than just an elective affinity between policing and social science in that way. And I think that we need to, I think, be more dig deeper into these intertwined histories and be a little bit more nuanced in our readings of that history.
Okay, there's one more question from the audience, and this may be slightly out of your wheelhouse, but thinking about the consistency you mentioned in policing personnel, practices, infrastructure, etc., what insights can your approach bring to understanding the relationship between policing in British colonial context and post-colonial contexts? And I don't know if this person has the Nigerian protests in mind, but that context has obviously raised a lot of questions about the kind of continuity and persistence of policing apparatuses.
Yeah. It's something that I've struggled a lot with, because on the one hand, again, like the New Left critique that puts a lot of blame on the United States is attractive to me in many, many ways. On the other hand, it's certainly the case, it's like I've seen various tweets here and there that are trying to blame, the police violence in Nigeria on the United States. And I'm hesitant to buy into that. Certainly, at least, I wouldn't blame necessarily the Office of Public Safety, because OPS never had a program in Nigeria. However, I do have a picture in the book of Byron Engel standing with a Nigerian official, because OPS helped Nigeria build a police training academy. So that's just to say that, like, I think it matters, how we, like actually doing the empirical research, which of course sometimes is quite challenging, I think is necessary to figure out what the relationship is and how some of these trajectories are long lasting. I again, for the people the scholars who claim that OPS didn't have a huge impact, I have kind of two responses. I mean, one is that the United States, as the hegemon or as the imperial power, has a great amount of influence over so many aspects of, social life on a global scale, political life on a global scale, economic life. On the other hand, more specifically, the Office of Public Safety designed its programming to have a long tail. So it would provide, tear gas up front, and then say, now y'all have to pay for it yourselves, like once our initial shipment runs out. Or what happened in Brazil, for example, Brazil just was like, well, we don't want to buy it from the United States. We're just going to build our own tear gas factory, right? And now Brazil is one of the chief exporters of tear gas around the globe, right? And that's attributable to OPS having kind of like jump-started the industry, right? Similarly, OPS required that people who were trained in the United States in its academy would be elevated when they got back home. So it might have been that somebody who was trained at the kind of level of a colonel or whatever rank, 2 decades later would be elevated to be the equivalent of, the J. Edgar Hoover of whatever country, right? OPS is long gone by that time, but the long kind of ramifications of the assistance, I think, need to be taken into account, even as they get a little fuzzy at the same time. So balancing that is really, I think, an empirical question that we can't necessarily just answer at a kind of theoretical level.
Yeah, there's also actually some interesting connections, not so much with the Nigerian police, but if the Hong Kong police is any story that we want to bring in, to go back to the British. I mean, US companies providing the tear gas in Hong Kong. Hong Kong police itself is a legacy of the Royal Hong Kong Police, which within the British Empire was known as a notoriously powerful paramilitary force, which was in turn modeled after the Irish Constabulary. And so there's a whole complex set of genealogies within the Anglo-American imperial sphere that I think, Stuart's book really compels us to think about, and gives us some tools to like analyze in a way that we hadn't been before.
Yeah, and I would also just say that there's an unfortunate divide between the U.S. carceral state literature and the imperial, policing literature having to do with the French Empire, the British Empire, and so forth. I think that in general, the European empires, like scholars, especially in the British Academy, have been pretty good about being attentive to the interrelationships between, colony and metropole in terms of policing. But that conversation has been happening totally separately from conversations about the carceral state in the United States. I think, maybe my dream would be like a real, big symposium where we bring all of these people together to just try to think through some of this stuff, where we can not just do kind of simple comparative work, but actually think through the interconnections at both empirical and kind of conceptual levels. I think we're the United States, the literature on the United States is a bit behind the curve here, but at the same time, I also think that the literature on the European colonies is also a little bit hamstrung in other ways, because it's a little bit siloed by different empires and different regions, and also is it's not clear that they're as willing to look at the contemporary imperial legacies as perhaps is warranted.
Stuart, I think we need to do that. We'll do that.
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah. I see that, you know, we have just a few minutes left. So I said I would maybe talk a little bit about my current research. So yeah, I've been working a little bit more on the question of what happens after 1975 and what happens after the Office of Public Safety closes, and just trying to kind of map out what it would look like to try to do the same type of analysis in a more contemporary vein. And I would basically just say it's almost unmanageable because the picture just becomes so big. Again, like I said, with private corporations, numerous agencies, you know, now you have, so it was just AID and the Department of State doing it in the 1960s. Now it's state, DOJ, DHS, DEA, Pentagon. You know, it's just like, you can just run down the list of acronyms. So it becomes very hard to even figure out where to look to understand U.S. police assistance in the contemporary moment. But it comes up in the news, you know, basically like every 6 months, there's a new story, right? Like there was just a story a couple of weeks ago about CBP trainers operating in Guatemala who were supposed to just be doing training work, but then they violated the rules and engaged in some operational activities, basically deporting Honduran asylum seekers back to Honduras from Guatemala. And so that just like raises a host of questions that I think are very similar to the questions that were on the table for the Office of Public Safety, which is like, what are the limits of US power? And you know, on the one hand, what are the legal limits? How is it codified in law? But then practically, like, can you actually just train and not become involved in these activities? So that's one piece, and like Adam said, I have an article coming out soon in N+1 that tries to lay out some of this stuff. And then I'm also, my major research project is about police as a political actor, how police basically since the 1960s through unions and professional organizations and so forth have engaged in politics, tried to influence electoral campaigns, have tried to influence city budgets and so forth. In a word, if I were to just kind of say what the project is about, you know, I wouldn't have put it this way 6 months ago, but since, you know, June, I've been saying this. It's about, if defund the police is the slogan, the new project that I'm working on is about how the police became so well funded in the first place. And my argument is basically that police have become a unique and semi-autonomous political actor, and that is how they've become so well resourced and so insulated from oversight and accountability.
That's a great place to end on in some ways, because this book, Badges Without Borders, already gives us a kind of preview of how that happens, how police end up becoming disassociated from partisan political machines, but in that moment of professionalization and a form of depoliticization, they emerge as different kinds of political actors that advocate for themselves in a variety of ways, that initiate policy. So for those on the call who haven't read the book yet, please check it out. It's an amazing, amazing book. Congratulations, Stuart, on it again. And we look forward to reading the N+1 article and this new project as it comes out.
Yeah, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. It's great so to have this conversation. I really appreciate all the questions from everybody. And I would just also say, you know, especially for grad students, if you have further questions, I'm easy to find. Please get in touch. I'd be happy to, you know, answer anything further or continue the conversation in the future.
All right, take care, everybody. You can go back to refreshing the tally count.
Exactly. Yeah, thank you.